Greetings! My name is Kyle Greenwood, and this is an action research study on an instructional intervention in scientific writing. This will be task 5, or the presentation of the capstone project. The research was an action research study utilizing an instructional intervention in scientific writing to aid the scientific writers respond to a scientific prompt. This intervention will incorporate an organizational writing strategy. What I was observing in my classroom is the students in my 8th grade class were struggling when writing a response to any of the scientific prompts that I was giving to them over the course of this past year. The impact was that my students were unable to respond in an effective manner to the scientific prompt. They were struggling with being able to complete the prompt, struggling to even start without a lot of help and support. And with that response, they were really struggling to state strong claims, support it with that textual evidence that we would read about, and then provide some reasoning on why that evidence supports that claim. One of the possible causes of my observations in this phenomena could be that the current instructional strategies that they have at their disposal are not being able to meet their needs as a learner at this current moment. And so I wanted to create one for them. My goal was to answer the question of how might explicit writing instruction impact students' ability to respond to a writing prompt in science, especially in my 8th grade classroom. To answer this question, I decided to use an action research study to gauge the effectiveness of an instructional intervention, which was designed with visual spacing for the claim, evidence, and reasoning sections in order to guide a middle school student when responding to a given scientific prompt. In order for those students to become comfortable and confident in using this writing intervention in order to gauge its effectiveness, I decided to have a 5-day time span with 30 minutes daily to gauge the effectiveness of a score from a pre-assessment to a post-assessment, comparing the two means together to find out if there was a growth and change from the pre to post-assessment. The pre-assessment would use their historical writing response format that they had seen over the course of this year, and the post-assessment would utilize the instructional intervention that they had just learned and practiced and mastered. In order to gauge that effectiveness, a common rubric was used for both the pre and post-assessment, and there was an analysis done gathering the quantitative data to compare those two means against each other. For this action research study, I utilized quantitative data in order to compare and contrast the pre- and post-assessment scores based on the analytical rubric. This plays into my goal and problem statement in that I want to find out what kind of growth, neutral, or regressive scores can be gathered from the rubric when utilizing this writing intervention. The pre-assessment will utilize the same rubric as the post-assessment, with the pre-assessment utilizing the traditional format with which the students have been used to all year, and the post-assessment being completed after the students have gone about doing the writing intervention for the purposes of this research, and then comparing those mean scores for each of the different sections from the pre to the post-assessment. In order for the data to be collected and analyzed effectively, there was going to need to be that quantitative data collection methodology as was previously discussed through that pre-assessment, utilizing their traditional writing methodology that we have used over the course of this entire school year. The instructional intervention was going to be given over 12 days total from the pre-assessment all the way to the post-assessment rubric grading in order to ensure that there were no absences and that there was sufficient time for the instructional intervention to be implemented accordingly. At the end of that instructional intervention, the post-assessment would utilize the writing intervention that they've just learned in order to respond to the same given writing prompt as was requested of them in the pre-assessment. Then, at the end, I was going to use descriptive statistics by comparing the mean scores for each of the different sections on the rubric. These sections were a claim, the evidence, the reasoning, and the overall flow and coherence. Each of these data analysis, descriptive statistics, were based on rubric scores of 0 to 4. 0 meaning that there was no attempt made at the work, and a 4 showing mastery of the content in that given area. Analyzing each of the student data, we can certainly see that no student regressed between the pre and post assessment, but instead were either neutral or increased in their skills when it comes to utilizing the writing intervention. Students that already had a high score, such as students number 3 and students number 11 and 13, already had a pretty high score in their pre-assessment and showed no growth whatsoever when it comes to the post-assessment utilizing the writing intervention. However, there was no regression amongst any of the students as evidenced in the data table, but students that had a low score in the beginning from the pre-assessment, such as students 12, 14, and 16, showed a double, if not greater, increase in their responses when it comes to utilizing the writing intervention. This is a grand total of the claim, evidence, reasoning, and flow and coherence scores that were tabulated to create this graph. Now, to gauge the effectiveness of not just individual students, but of the larger group, such as the total 17 students that participate in the research study, we can see that the clarity of evidence and reasoning sections showcase the highest amount of growth in compared to the other 4 sections. However, all 4 sections, from the strength of claim, clarity of evidence, reasoning, flow and coherence, we can see a positive increase in the pre- and post-assessment scores after utilizing the writing intervention. This is shown in the far right-hand side, where we can still see a marked uptick in the scores in comparison to the pre- and post-assessment for the 17 participating students, no matter their background. 4 of the students exhibited high levels of growth when it comes to the pre- and post-assessment scores. Though students number 10 and 2 already had a somewhat strong claim, it was very evident that the writing intervention was beneficial for these 4 students because of the increase in scores of their clarity of evidence and reasoning when utilizing the analytical rubric. These 4 students seemed to struggle the most, especially student 12, with the pre-assessment as given due to the historical nature of having the exact same format all over the course of the year, and instead the post-assessment utilizing the writing intervention shows how much benefit these 4 students gained. Looking at the results in conclusion, there was statistically significant growth by all of the participating 17 students who were a part of this research study. Looking at their evidence sections, there was a 23% average growth for all 17 students, 20% growth in the reasoning, and an overall increase in all 4 areas of 18%. Now, certain students who showed a high pre-assessment score did not show much benefit from the writing intervention, but there was no regression either. It is evident that if there was a high pre-assessment score, the likelihood of them maintaining that high score was still going to be present at the conclusion of the post-assessment from utilizing the writing intervention. Certain students who struggled with the pre-assessment showed a marked improvement in their writing skills after utilizing the instructional writing intervention in their response to this given scientific prompt. This tool, designed for students to aid in their writing abilities, would be applicable in other subject areas because of the amount of claim, evidence, and research assignments that have been given in content areas such as English language arts and social studies. Some of the strengths of this action research study was a growth in the total percentage of completion by the 17 students who were a part of this research study. Of those students, there was significant growth in the evidence and reasoning sections. That could be attributed to the visual nature of the writing intervention, where they're able to gather their evidence from their readings and their other memories to put into those graphic organizational sections, and then be able to explain how those evidences reflect and support that claim. Having a visual marker and designation for those different areas allows for students to focus better on those different sections instead of being overwhelmed by lots of lines and having lots of open space with which to work. They can then translate those items found in the instructional intervention into their other coursework, such as ELA and social studies, when writing in responses to claim, evidence, and reasoning-based assignments. There was also growth or neutral for all the different types of learner backgrounds. There were students with IEPs, 504s, English language learners, high cap, and students with no designated markers. However, all of them either showed that positive growth or stayed the same. Some weaknesses of this action research study was that there was a small sample size. Having only 17 students is not the best methodology with which to base the next steps, other than to increase that sample size to see how different backgrounds of learners or having multiple types of students in a different category would respond to the writing intervention. Additionally, a lot of my students had really positive relationships with myself because of the year-long nature of our class. And so relying on those relationships could have contributed to a higher participation score or a higher want in order to please the teacher or to have more faith in themselves instead of having more abilities for these students to have a different variety of backgrounds and different relationships with their instructors going forward. There was also a struggle in the writing intervention when translating the visual separation of these different sections and putting them all back together, as their transitionary sentence structures were not as prevalent. And that was showed through the flow and coherence sections, which showed a lack of growth because, in comparison to the evidence reasoning scores, because of the copy and paste nature of the sections to all come together as a final product in that post-assessment. These transitionary sentences would then maybe need to have a bit more working before utilizing it in a classroom. The key influential factor to the action research study is going to be the student and teacher dynamic, which was cultivated over the course of this past full year, and for some of the 17 participating students the past 2 years. To mitigate this influential factor, the pre-assessment used a format that they have been utilizing and seeing all past year, and for some of them the past 2 years. This allows the writing intervention to be gauged on its effectiveness as is, and this influential factor was instead able to translate itself across both the pre and post assessment and hopefully gauge the effectiveness of only the writing intervention and not the teacher and student interactions influencing the data itself. For further investigation, it would be super beneficial for other subject areas to be able to assess whether this writing intervention will be able to apply to their coursework in addition to the growth that I saw in the science prompts itself. Having courses as described in ELA or in social studies where there are lots of claim, evidence, and reasoning type assignments that are given or prompts that are given for the students to respond to, it would be very interesting to see what kind of growth, neutral, or maybe even regression in those other content areas. Or is this writing intervention able to carry over from subject to subject, or is it able to help them in science and then maybe subliminally or subconsciously helps them to organize their mental thoughts to be able to effectively respond better in those other courses? Additionally, it would be helpful to observe and analyze the instructional intervention over the course of the entire school year. It would be better to have a gauge of the student's growth with the writing intervention instead of over a 12-day period. Maybe you have it over the course of an entire year period, adjusting and manipulating the writing intervention to meet the needs of that particular student in order to find out what's effective for the different types of learners. Studying their growth after the writing intervention is no longer a requirement, but just another tool at their disposal. Having students be able to utilize the writing intervention, and whether that they use it as is, or if they just take it and personalize it themselves, or the way that the writing intervention was organized into distinct sections, perhaps that's what helps train their minds in order to gather all the data, influence the claim to match whatever that evidence is going to say, and then they're able to create that coherence and flow and transitionary sentence structure, but not necessarily use the writing intervention itself, but instead they're doing it all mentally. And that brings us to the end of this action research study, utilizing a writing intervention inside of a scientific classroom in response to scientific given prompts. Thank you so much. My name is Kyle Greenwood. This presentation template was made in Microsoft PowerPoint, and all of the icons that are contained within the presentation were also contained within that program. Thank you again.